Big rail projects in the UK haven't always been plain sailing. There have been several examples, especially in the last 35 years, like the Channel Tunnel to the Jubilee Line extension or HS1. The finances or miscalculations can easily dent public confidence. And whilst financially it could come across to some as a complete failure in the short term, however long term, when more and more people use them, it could be claimed to be a success when it comes down to passenger usage and resulting revenue generated does financially break even. Well, in this case, Crossrail, or technically now known as the Elizabeth Line, is no exception to it. So far, while it's been several years late, but as of right now, to many people, it seems to have so far been worth the wait. There is a bit of a saying, like a football team, that to gain the success, you have to go through the short-term pain for the long-term gain, which so far the Elizabeth Line and TfL themselves have had to go through that experience. So the question of the video is this: has the Elizabeth Line been worth waiting for? So let's get into it. So the big news that was revealed back on September 28th is the next steps to come, as the Elizabeth Line is now moving closer to finally being completed. So on Monday, October 24th, exactly 5 months on, after the first part of the central section from Paddington to Abbey Wood opened, it will be the opening of the long-delayed Bond Street station. It's had so many problems, from logistics, supplies to engineering difficulties, and of course recently the COVID pandemic has caused huge headaches for engineers. When I went past it back on August 4th, it definitely looked like a station ready to go, just needed the final pieces of the interior needs to be finished being fitted out. And now, over the last few weeks, to finish off the station, which includes staff familiarization, training, and making sure it's ready to go for public use. So when it does open, it will end that long wait for its first interchange at Bond Street since the Jubilee Line first served there back in May 1979. However, it wasn't the only thing to be announced, because 13 days later, on Sunday, November 6th, well, it's technically on to the penultimate stage of the project. So from November 6th, it will be the beginning of the Elizabeth Line Central section, running 7 days a week. Now, the only two exceptions have been so far, firstly back in June with the Diamond Platinum Jubilee weekend, and also just a few weeks ago on the weekends of September the 17th and 18th. However, the second one came at a sad time of national mourning in the UK after the loss of the former Queen Elizabeth II herself back on September 8th at Balmoral Castle at the age of 96. Also on November 6th, it's when Central services via Stratford start to run to Paddington for the first time, which will burrow underground at Pudding Mill Lane Portal, next door to the DLR station of Pudding Mill Lane, and then eventually will join up with the Abbey Wood branch just before Whitechapel. So the plan, according to TfL, is that the only Elizabeth Line trains that will run to London Liverpool Street Main Line station on Mondays to Fridays will only be peak hours services to and from Gidea Park. Outside that, on weekends, from time to time, the only thing you'll get going on the Surrey lines from Stratford to London Liverpool Street will either be C2C services from Shoeburyness via Leyden, running on the Surrey lines, and occasionally some greater angular services that sometimes can be diverged onto the Surrey lines just before Stratford via platform 5. Also on that day, for Abbey Wood services themselves, they will give Londoners a preview of what to expect by the time the full timetable comes around mid-May 2023, which will run services direct from Abbey Wood to Reading and Heathrow's Terminal 4 and 5, which also coincides with Elizabeth Line services running into London Paddington themselves. As of this moment in time, will then eventually move downstairs completely, with trains entering the tunnel at Royal Oak Portal before joining the slow lines of the Great Western Main Line just after the former site of the former BR platforms of Westbourne Park. And then eventually, the estimated date that TfL is aiming for the final stage to complete the full running of the Elizabeth Line, as I just mentioned, is around mid-May 2023. However, in case if you're asking, well, why not before then? Well, I'll get onto that bit later on. Now, along with the two confirmed dates for Bond Street and the penultimate stage of Elizabeth Line, there is still some work to do to make sure everything on the line is working smoothly and reliably as possible. Let's start with the technological side of things. So, I'm going to be very honest here that technology for any modern railway or modern train is over complex and requires a lot of software updates from time to time. And making sure the Elizabeth line itself is working, especially when the full network does eventually start operating, is making sure that all the signaling systems are talking to each other. Whether it's the in-cab CBTC community-based system for the central section from Paddington to Abbey Wood, Canary Wharf, the TBWS train protection warning system on the Great Eastern Main Line, and the AWS automatic warning system for Great Western Main Line, although those two could be updated to future ETCS. Well, that's presently on the Heathrow branch, which was installed back in 2020. So, according to TfL, there is a plan that the next step to make sure what's to come later on down the line will be on October 23rd. The day before Bond Street is due to open. So the fact is at this present time, outside the two dates I've mentioned for the Diamond Jubilee and of course the weekend of the Queen's funeral, is that Elizabeth Line Central section hasn't been running on Sundays. So on October 23rd is when TfL planned to test out full timetable running in preparations continue for mid-May 2023. In recent months, other things have been happening, including back on weekend of July 23rd and 24th, when TfL carried out its previous major updates with the software, which in turn removed 18 of the 19 restrictions. However, its most recent slight update was done back on the bank holiday weekend of August 27th-28th. That's just to remove a software bug. The next planned update, which is the final major software update to get the line fully ready, is planned for around Christmas, New Year time, which will remove the final restriction and also enable activation of a particular feature called Auto Reverse. And now you're probably wondering, what is Auto Reverse? Okay, well, here's a simple explanation. So Auto Reverse will only be used by Class 345s terminating at Paddington, especially when the line on its central section, eventually when full timetable running does start, will plan to run 24 trains per hour, which if you put that in maths calculation is one train every 2 to 2.5 minutes between Paddington and Whitechapel. So what it will do is, instead of a normal reversing manoeuvre, where the driver will drive the train into the siding manually, well instead the auto reverse will do most of the work, which the train will move on its own, whilst the driver then proceeds to walk down the night car, Class 345, from the front of the train to the rear cab, which enables quicker turnaround time, which in normal cases on average is around 5 to 10 minutes, depending on destination. So in some ways, to some, it sounds like the auto reverse feature could come across as similar to a driverless train, like on the DLR at Bank Station. Could the auto reverse feature on the London Underground itself, especially with the lines that, as of this video, have been resignalled with semi-ATO? Well, who knows, and time will tell on that. Now, back to the point about the estimated completion date of May 2023 by TfL, and some of you are now wondering, well, why can't you just open it in January 2023 after the final main software update is updated over the Christmas New Year period? But as I've mentioned already, modern day technology is way over complex, and well, like anything modern these days, you always are going to get teething problems that cannot be solved overnight. And as the former TfL Commissioner Andy Byford explained, that it's better to wait until May to give the systems time to settle down. For example, when you go back to June 2011, when the Jubilee line was completely resignalled, 18 months later than it originally was supposed to be finished, well, it had major problems with regular power failures over a 12-month period, and it took until just before the 2012 Olympic Games to sort it out. And the main reason for that was because the systems could not cope. And eventually, by the time the Olympic Games came, eventually the system finally ran smoothly. Apart from the one day during the games, it did have its moment of power failure, but other than that, it operates more smoothly, and so far has actually been very reliable most of the time. Also enabled TfL to learn the lessons to make it easier when they were getting in for the resignaling of the Northern Line, which was because of the Jubilee Line debacle was nearly 2 years late, which originally was supposed to be completed in summer 2012, however it wasn't completed in the end until June 2014. But because lessons were learned from that experience originally, the resignaling of the Northern Line actually went much more smoothly. Since then, the signalling systems being used for both Northern Jubilee lines, the self-track signalling system developed by Belgian firm Thales, in the long term has been adapted since then, not just for, at the time of this video, for the full subsurface line resignaling, but also has been adopted for Thameslink between St Pancras International and London Blackfriars, and also as a factor for the ATO section between Paddington and of course Abbey Wood on the Elizabeth line itself. So if anyone watches motorsport, well, you can't win a motor race on the first lap, but you can certainly lose it. Or another example, like the Mans 24 Hours, it's a marathon, not a sprint, which over the years the overall winner of one of the world's famous endurance races has been won by those opting to play safe and take it steady on strategy rather than just be fast and end up wearing down equipment. So regardless of what views you have on TfL and the delays of the Elizabeth line, however, you have to credit them in some ways by taking the long approach of phasing in the line and enabling systems to settle down more smoothly and will eventually become more easier to manage in the long term. So onto the financial side of things, and so far it's mixed overall. Starting with the bad news. And yes, that the cost of the project as of this video right now is estimated going to be around £15.8 billion, which will probably be more than that by the time it's completed, hopefully by mid-May next year. In fact, other government rail projects have had a similar issue in the short term when they were originally completed. Firstly, the Channel Tunnel. When that was opened in May 1994, it was a year late. In the end, it costed around £9 billion, which would be equivalent to £20 to £22 billion in today's money. Then a few years after that, the Jubilee Line extension would open between May and December 1999. But, like the Channel Tunnel, that was also late. The final cost in the end for that cost around £3.5 billion, which is equal to around 7 to 8 billion in today's money. However, in that case, it was a year late due to a near catastrophe near Heathrow caused by a tunnel collapse due to problems discovered with the new Austrian tunneling method when it came to the ground conditions that the tunnels were being made to drill under. The finish though, the story about that's for another day, not on this one. However, the long-term implications from the financial side of the JLE being late would end up setting TfL back in the process years. Despite that, when it was eventually completed, it was an instant hit with passengers and was a key catalyst in the continued revival of the Docklands area that was originally started by the DLR back in 1987, including the Canary Wharf area, North Greenwich, home of the highly controversial Millennium Dome at the time when it opened, before the dawn of the new millennium, which we know today is now known as the O2 Arena, and also vital for East London areas such as Canning Town, West Ham, and of course the line terminus itself at Stratford. While the news on the financial side doesn't sound good, however, there is hope for optimism. Despite the recent pandemic, TfL having to be bailed out by the British government, the constant infighting between the Mayor of London and DfT about long-term funding for TfL is that, according to finances, it's predicted that the Elizabeth Line should break even by the end of the financial year of 2023-2024, and based on recent passenger figures from the first few months since the first part of the central section opening back on May 24th this year, it does look very promising, and it will determine whether for TfL it will be key for them to eventually fund itself going forward after their present government deal that was agreed a few weeks ago does eventually run out. I did a recent poll on my community post back on October 6th that most of those so far voted for yes, it's been worth the wait, some will reserve judgment till it's fully open, and a few who haven't quite been convinced as of yet. For me, one thing is almost certain, that you could say for sure now that after all the rows, supply issues, software problems, financial issues, and a pandemic, well, it looks like now with it being on the final straight to the finish line, and yes, whilst it's been over 3 years late, but whilst agree to disagree, it looks like the Elizabeth Line has been worth the wait. So, I want to hear from you. What do you think of the Elizabeth line in general as a whole? And have you been on the new central section of the line? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And you can leave a like, share and subscribe for more rail content. And to those who have followed my channel, thank you so much for your support. And until the next video, see you next time. Bye guys.